Several.
Nobody has read off the list of Arab states.
The list of Arab states.
There's 22.
Yes.
And how many people in this room can list them?
All right. Take one volunteer while he gets his microphone on. Who can name all the 22 Arab states? Who in this room can name all of the Arab states who's not on the panel? Go ahead. Stand up. Yes. Yalla, go. Yell it out. Just yell it out. No introductions.
Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Kuwait, Iraq, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Emirat, Yemen Shabiya, Yemen Janubiya.
No, that's one.
No.
11.
Yemen and Sudan twice, okay. Masr, Sudan, Somal, Djibouti, Libya, Mauritania, Tunis, Maghreb,
Algeria.
Aljazeera.
Missing 2 according to my account.
Saudiya.
Well, that's okay. You did. Did she say Bahrain? Yes. All right. Comoros.
No.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
جزر القمر.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a member in the Arab League.
Well, so I know people are still coming in, but let's start to stick to the schedule. I just will, before I introduce Anisa, I wanted to share some good news with you about the ADC website. We are trying to improve the website, and it needs lots of improvement. So we just got a grant this week to move forward on the new website. So we will definitely have a new website running within the next few weeks or a couple months maximum. And I think that will make communicating with our membership even better. We have new platforms on the website, including one that I want to share with you now. We're starting a media watch, like a media accountability page. So each one of you can go to that media watch page and report what you see on your local TVs or you hear on your radios. Anything that has to do with Arab Americans. And the ADC can help address the media reporting. From now until the website is running, feel free to contact me directly in case you see anything that has to do with Arab Americans on TV or you hear it on the radio or you read it in the press. My email address is really easy, media@adc.org. So no one will forget it, right? Media@adc. We just need the time of when the, whatever news or news story was broadcasted and what they said roughly. If you have a video of it, it will be better. And we'll try to address any concerns of our constituencies. Let me briefly introduce Anisa, and then she will introduce the rest of the panelists and the panel itself. Anisa is an Emmy Award-winning film director and a broadcast journalist. Her work bridges issues of religion and culture, peace and politics, tourism and women's empowerment. She worked for 20 years for mainstream media, including CBS, ABC, public television, public radio, and National Geographic. And I think she's working on a third documentary on Hajj now for PBS. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Anisa.
Thank you. We are starting our panel on Arab people's time. But we're going to have to finish it on American people's time. So we've cut down by almost at least 15, 20 minutes our time together. And we've all agreed that we want to have a good deal of this period together to interact with you and to get your questions, because we are all, after all, sitting in a room full of potential citizen journalists, right? So we want to figure out, what does that mean? And what are the standards, if we can establish some standards? And to start, we're going to find out about some of the standards with regard to professional journalists. So here we are at a time of transition where speed is even speedier than could have been imagined. I'm reminded of Mark Twain's statement, and it's attributed to Mark Twain, it may not be his, that a lie will be halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its shoes. So we need to keep that in mind as we go forward, issues of accuracy and accountability. Three fabulous journalists here for me to interview and for you to question today. I thought, how do I interview them? Do we go ladies first? I'm in the old school of ladies first, or was I going to do alphabetical order? When I did alphabetical order, last name and first name, it came out with Abderrahim Foukara first in both. And I've got to ask you to not, this is what I do when I'm teaching. Please put away your cell phones.
I can't let go of mine.
The minute he sat down for lunch, he had his phone out, so it's a whole new world. All right, so fine. Abderrahim Foukara is the Washington bureau chief for Al-Jazeera Arabic. Thank goodness Al-Jazeera is available in this country now. There was a time when it was not. I'm proud to say in 2002, my family awarded the Anisa Mehdi Courage in Journalism Award to Al-Jazeera. Are you aware of this?
No.
Because even before the American invasion of Iraq in 2003 and before Tahrir Square, we recognized that Al-Jazeera was sending shockwaves through the American media, and we said single-handedly forced the often biased and unobjective American media to second-guess its own reporting. Very proud of Al-Jazeera. Abderrahim is a native African, born in Morocco, where he majored in English, and then moved to England, where he got a PhD in Africana studies. So interesting, leaving one place to go to the other and study the other. Has a very sound broadcasting CV, a decade with the BBC World Service, coming to the USA to work in public radio and public television since 2002 with Al Jazeera, the first as a DC reporter, then running the United Nations office for Al Jazeera, and now Washington bureau chief. He hosts Min Washington, from Washington, which is a cultural affairs and American politics roundtable discussion. What I was also interested to know when we spoke earlier and we communicated was that he came to this field because you loved sound, you said.
Correct.
The sound of a broadcaster's voice and the power of that to transform our world. And really appreciate that stand. Ahmed Shihab-Eldin got his master's in journalism at the J School at Columbia University, and he was able to fill me in on my alma mater, how things have changed there over the last couple of years. He also teaches at the J School as an adjunct. He is now a host producer for the Huffington Post, doing HuffPost Live. You may have seen his handsome face on the screen. We don't say on the air anymore,
No.
do we?
Wow.
What do we say? On the web?
Online. Streaming.
Online. Streaming. He also had a stint at Al Jazeera with the show The Stream. Streaming, The Stream. And has written for the New York Times, has worked with PBS's Wide Angle and Frontline, and is a regular blogger. I want to congratulate you on your Webby Award.
Thank you.
Project called Defining Middle Ground, the Next Generation of Muslim New Yorkers. Family is Palestinian, so as many Palestinian families, he's lived all over the world, California to Kuwait, Cairo to Vienna, and now back in New York City. Welcome.
Thank you.
And Barbara Slavin came to journalism, she said, with a curiosity about the world, in particular, the countries we consider to be our adversaries. As a foreign student in the Soviet Union, she saw that what she was reading in the newspaper was not what she was seeing on the street. And I think many of us who travel discover that that's the case. We're seeing something right in front of our eyes, and that is not what we're hearing on the radio or in television or reading in newspapers. And there's a gap that people like Barbara and my other panelists are filling, and perhaps you too as citizen journalists. I looked at the list of places you covered: North Korea, Iran. I'm thinking you should get a gig with the Axis of Evil comedy tour.
I would love to. I used to call myself the Queen of the Rogues, so.
The Queen of the Rogues, very good. She has written for the New York Times Week in Review. She's written at the Washington Times, USA Today, The Economist. I mean, this is a very gilded resume. Now, Barbara is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's South Asia Center, and she writes for Almonitor.com. And so, keeping her cynicism at bay, Barbara says she's using her journalism platform to build bridges and to encourage peace wherever possible. So I want to get into that because I want us to talk about our role as reporters. Is that a game we should be playing, or do we maintain that objectivity? But before we get there, I'd like to start with Barbara and get a sense of what it is that Al-Monitor is. It's very new, and your role at Al-Monitor.
Okay. Al-Monitor just started last February, a year back, and it has grown and grown and grown, and I recommend it to those who haven't taken a look. It has a very broad definition of the Middle East, everything from Iran through Morocco plus Turkey. And we have a combination of translations from local media plus original content. And I think when we started, it was mostly translations, and now it's mostly original content. Some phenomenal columnists from Lebanon, from Iraq, from Palestine, from Israel. Israel is included too, and this makes it unusual because you have it all on one site. We have some of the finest columnists from Israel, people who've written for Haaretz and Mariv and so on, in addition to great people like Daoud Kutab writing on Palestinian issues. In Washington, we have a small bureau. I'm Washington Correspondent, that's my title, so I try to focus on the region from an American perspective. I look a lot at US policy toward the Middle East, and fortunately or unfortunately, I get to express my views a bit these days. I'm at the stage in my career where I'm really more of a columnist than I am a reporter per se. Although I still like to go and cover stories, I still go and do interviews with people, and I know how to write a straight news story, but I am allowed a little bit of license.
You've earned it, I think.
After all these years, particularly on Iran. I wrote a book on Iran a few years back, and I've been very distressed by US policy toward Iran for a number of years, so I feel like I'm entitled to say a few things.
You are, and I'd like to plug her book, which is called Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies. Isn't that? Wow.
Yeah.
So go out and get it.
This actually came from something someone told my husband at a dinner party in Cairo, where we were based for 4 years in the 1980s. So it works for a lot of countries. And certainly it works for a lot of the Arab countries as well, that we have this kind of love-hate relationship with the governments and often with the people of these countries. One other thing about Al-Monitor, I should mention that we have a very, very talented blogger, Laura Rosen, who does something called the Back Channel, which is full of diplomatic gossip about anything to do with the Middle East and who's going and who's coming, and she picks up a lot of interesting things, so I highly recommend that as well to the folks out here.
When you say who's going and coming, you don't mean the leaders, correct?
I mean various personnel in the US government who deal with the Middle East, and so you might want to know who on the National Security Council is going to be handling Egypt or dealing with Morocco or something like that. So I think it's very useful for folks.
Thank you. And that's print and online.
It's online only.
Online, but it is
no print.
writing, and as distinguished from visual images and audio, which Abderrahim Foukara deals in, right, with television and with online. You talk about Al-Jazeera and what you do there.
Well,
Terminology is beyond me by now.
I run the Bureau for the Arabic Channel here in DC and throughout the United States. We, together with our colleagues from the English channel, are all housed in the same building on K Street, and soon we'll have a third channel, which everybody knows about, and that's the channel for Al-Jazeera for the United States. And basically what we do, as far as the Arabic channel is concerned, we cover DC, anything that has anything to do with the Arab world, but also anything that has anything to do with the United States per se. Because up until a few years ago, most of our focus was on Washington inside the Beltway. And then a determination was made that by focusing solely on what happens inside the Beltway, we were giving our viewers in North Africa and the Middle East a skewed view of the United States. So we tried to widen the circle, and now we travel all over the country, and we don't cover just politics. We cover politics, we cover religion, the economy, what have you, to give people a more rounded picture of what happens in the United States and how that impacts their lives wherever they may be.
And you're running crews and you have to bring the material back and edit, or you edit on site now?
We are almost self-sustained. We do everything here. All the news gathering is done here. All the production is done here. The post-production is done here. For the Arabic channel, the only thing that's not done here is really minimal stuff, such as captions and titles which they do in Doha. For our colleagues in the English channel, they have a little bit more leeway in terms of what they put out. Sometimes they may not need to go to Doha at all, but then again, we are a bureau, they are a hub, one of the what was originally the 4 hubs of Al-Jazeera English around the world.
Thanks.
Yeah.
What about cyberspace? What's a day in the life of cyberspace like?
Well, that could be a very naughty conversation, but I think in the journalism realm, I want to just actually follow up just for the sequence of this discussion on what you were speaking about Al-Jazeera and its success story and its coming to America. And I've worked for Al-Jazeera on 2 occasions, once in Qatar for a while and then in DC. And the reason I want to focus on Al-Jazeera is because Al-Jazeera, more than any other media organization, I would argue, has been able to illuminate what is so compelling about cyberspace or about citizen journalism, which is what we're here to discuss. And that is that it focuses on character-driven stories, personal stories, stories that are on location. Even if it's a foreign journalist or correspondent, oftentimes they spend a very long time dispatched there. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because when I got into the field of journalism, I was compelled by the amount of information that was coming up around the world and that was being tweeted and shared perhaps before everybody or the internet penetration allowed for so many people in the Arab world specifically to be on Twitter. And I think it's important to highlight that because what is happening on cyberspace generally is that everybody now is broadcasting and consuming and collecting and curating and synthesizing information irregardless of whether mainstream media networks are paying attention. And that's why Al-Jazeera was one of the first mainstream media networks to pay attention to the Arab uprisings, which obviously we all know started in Tunisia. But there was a period of time where even Al-Jazeera seemingly missed the story. And so that really speaks to what does happen on cyberspace, which is information, ideas, news, reporting is shared in real time and disseminated, and then you'll find, if you focus on the trajectory of a news story, for example, whether it's the Turkey protests now or the depressing but equally compelling story of the war in Syria, that things tend to surface on the internet before they get to the mainstream media today. Whether it's Whitney Houston's death, okay, we're here in the Arab conference, why is he talking about Whitney Houston's death? Well, because that story broke 45 minutes before it made it to even the American networks or any network on Twitter. Osama bin Laden's death, which also happened to be the first airing of the Stream's online show, which aimed to tap into these conversations, was broken, arguably, on Twitter. Of course, there's a lot of misinformation as well, and I don't want to speak too much at length, but the last thing I will say is that I think if there's any really big takeaway of what happens on cyberspace, the truth is anything can happen on cyberspace. And that's why there is, for as much as there's compelling information and reporting, there's misinformation. And that's why I can't let go of my phone, because if, God forbid, something were to happen here, even though we do have cameras rolling, I would be able to run behind this desk perhaps and shoot a video of the fire or whatever it was that was to happen, upload it online, and there I'd be reporting, arguably.
But why
You
is
know,
this-
addicts always find a
Right,
good reason for being
truly.
addicted.
But, this always comes back to why is the fire here news, but the fact that we are gathered here having this conversation, not news?
Well, I would argue they both should be news. And they both would be news. But, the fire is more compelling because it has the shock, and to use Bush's phrase, shock and awe value.
Well, it's also true that we are drawn to tragedy. That's why we still think Shakespeare's plays are valid in today's world, right? Because there's trauma and loss and murder and all of that good stuff that we go to. But I'm curious. I want to go back to Barbara with this question, and we're going to talk about standards for the professionals, and then we're going to see if they apply still to and they don't possibly apply for citizen journalism. We're supposed to be, we who are trained, objective, distant, neutral, balanced, and so on and so forth. Yet for you, and for, I would argue, probably everybody up here, we want to build bridges, and we want to see conflicts resolved. It's important to make a difference. How do you reconcile those two ways of being, those two stands, both of which are important?
I think that, the most important aspect of journalism, whatever kind you practice, is educational. And particularly if you're dealing with foreign cultures for an American audience, your obligation is to explain the adversary, to see the world through their eyes and make that comprehensible to people. And I think that in itself can have a bridge building and a peacemaking function. Because once you understand the grievances of these people out there that you're writing about, it maybe becomes a little bit harder for you to be hostile, to be angry, to advocate military action as the only way to resolve conflicts with them. So, I've always felt that that was the role, particularly of the foreign correspondent when I was a foreign correspondent, was to go somewhere, scoop up everything I could, understand the culture, and explain it to the American audience.
Is that, however, do either of you have anything to add to that in terms of building bridges and the?
Let me add. Sometimes
Okay.
you have to be honest. So it's hard to build bridges, for example, with a guy like the outgoing Iranian president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who has said many outrageous things and done a lot of harm to his country. And if somebody is going to be outrageous, you have to report that as it is.
True.
Yeah.
You have to say what is so.
And then explain that he doesn't represent, a nation of 70 million people any more than a terrorist bomber will represent, a particular country that he or she might come from.
But it's that end piece that often isn't reported.
One thing I just want to quickly touch on when it comes to building bridges, and perhaps this is a different take, is, that's where social media and citizen journalism, I think, really excels. Perhaps it's not professional in the sense that these people aren't trained. Whether we call them reporters is something we go back and forth on. But if you look at what's happened in the world, really, not just the region, everybody here knows the word occupy, right? And its relevance. Well, why? And you might dismiss me as some young person who's obsessed with Occupy and whatnot, but if you think about what journalism is, in terms of building bridges, we've seen bridges built between cultures that otherwise, and governments that otherwise are antagonistic.
Examples. Give us some examples.
Egypt, Tahrir Square, the fact that the Occupy Wall Street movement started as a movement that was challenging militarism, that was challenging the militarization of police specifically, and that story has continued today. And citizen journalism and the internet at the end of the day was built to be a global village, and that's what we're all wrestling with. Just journalists, governments are all trying to understand how to control information, which is at the end of the day something that many media organizations might not publicly say that they're trying to do, but that's essentially what they're doing in disseminating information. And that's starting to be deconstructed. We talk about what's happening in the Arab world, and I often say this, which is the democratization of the Arab world, of these governments, of these societies. You can't look at that without focusing on the democratization of media and information. And that's the bridge, I think, that's also connecting cultures that otherwise might be at odds with one another. Even what's happening in Turkey, so different than what happened in Egypt, and yet we see patterns. We see, the Prime Minister Erdogan, who, by the way, was the first politician to be on Twitter, calling Twitter a menace to society, which is which really does, even though he's been consolidating his popularity, and the reason I mention this is because, it's different than Egypt, it's different than Tunisia, it's different than Bahrain and other
And
countries.
this surprises us. They're different people, different cultures, even separate cultures within these countries. And yet now, for the American public, oh my goodness, they're not all the same.
Right, and the reaction to the citizen reporting through Twitter, for example, calling Twitter an ultimate menace to society, when all of your politicians are on Twitter, when you were the first politician to be on, I think highlights the power of citizen journalism and how mainstream media organizations leverage it to communicate their information.
Well, let's ask Abderrahim something about this.
Before you do, though, I was going to say that Al-Jazeera was really what broke this open, because when I lived in Egypt in the 1980s, television, there was state television,
Right.
and that was, what did Hosni Mubarak have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner,
Yes.
right? So, it's quite incredible.
Before 1990, and I only grew up in Egypt in the 90s, but I knew, and just from studying, most media was under government supervision directly in the region. I remember I got there a year before the internet got to Egypt, and I was on ICQ, which is, I learned later, actually owned by an Israeli company, and it was started by an Israeli company, and there were Egyptians using this, not Western-made technology, but an Israeli-made technology, communicating with each other about things that in public you could never discuss. And that's, I think, at the end of the day, the power of this, and it goes back to the 90s.
Well, let me ask this of Abderrahman, because Al Jazeera has been open to citizen intrusion and inclusion. How do you vet what goes up on that website? How do you vet the information that's coming in from all these sources, people who don't know about authenticating from 3 separate sources if your information is accurate?
It's a real challenge, but before I address that, let me just very quickly go back to the issue of building bridges. Because when I hear about building bridges, in journalism, the very notion of building bridges is editorializing. Because who are you to build bridges? Who gives you that authority to build bridges? So all these questions are out there. And then the other thing is that the media in general, whether it's print media, television, or social media, but I would say much more so, for sure, television and social media. All media are part of the solution, they are part of the problem. If you take television, for example, particularly television in how it's been pioneered by this country, the United States, I think television is a wonderful medium, otherwise I wouldn't be working in it. But I think that one of the aspects of the menace that television constitutes is the 24-hour cycle, news cycle. There isn't a chance in heaven or hell that you can fill 24 hours with worthwhile educational stuff. You're gonna have to pad, and that's where the menace happens. And then when you pad and you force your reporters, for example, deployed around the world, to do piece after piece and meet deadline after deadline after, you basically throw them into the meat grinder, and the focus becomes not so much the bridge building or the search for the proverbial truth. It becomes meeting your deadline. It becomes keeping the beast happy and fed, and that's a huge problem. I mean, I totally agree with what Barbara said, that by covering all these different things happening around the world, a large part of that is educational. You educate your audience about other parts of the world and the problems that they are facing. But we as journalists, we're human beings. And aside from anything else, we have our own personal agendas very often. So trying to keep those personal agendas in check is another channel. But to come back to the vetting that you mentioned, Al-Jazeera, as we've heard, without doing further advertising for my channel, but Al-Jazeera was precursory in the use of social media. Long before the story of Tahrir Square, Al-Jazeera did a little experiment, and it did it in the parliamentary elections in Egypt in 2010. And they basically got a bunch of young Egyptians who are trustworthy. How do you define trustworthy?
Trustworthy for the Egyptian.
No, trustworthy for Al Jazeera.
Okay.
How you define that obviously leaves room for debate. But trustworthy young people, they gave them cameras, and they said, okay, we want you to funnel through Egypt and see what's happening around polling stations. And they did. And the video started to come in. And on the strength of that video that started to come in, there was incontrovertible evidence that there had been vote rigging in the parliamentary election of 2010. But obviously, Twitter and Facebook and the rest of it, it became huge on the map because of what happened in Tahrir Square. But Egypt was actually the easier part in terms of how you vet. You get tangled in much more complicated situations such as Libya or Syria. There was a time in Syria where most of the footage, most of the pictures that we saw on Al Jazeera and many other networks came actually from citizen journalists, YouTube and what have you. And you're never gonna get it 100% right, just like anything else in journalism. But you try to minimize the risk and increase the credibility. And so what you do, you have a team, for example, sitting in headquarters, receiving this stuff. And the stuff that it received, it was tagged to particular names. And then you go around, you build your own network, and you go around asking people who know about that person feeding us that stuff if he is trustworthy. In a way, it's like the old Islamic tradition of thiqa. You look for thuqat, people you trust before you put on.
Are they credible? Are they trustworthy?
Exactly, they're trustworthy.
You can also tell, though. I mean, if the stuff that comes time after time is reliable,
Right,
then you
yes.
know that's a good source.
Yes.
If they feed you something that turns out to be completely wrong, then you don't use that person again.
I wanted to also add, if I can, like one thing that is often, I think, a misconception that is widely held is that social media or citizen journalism is a threat to media, or that it's going to replace media. At the end of the
You mean
day,
professional?
Professional,
Okay.
yeah. But, well, yeah, professional media. And to be honest, you know, just to touch on again what he was talking about when it comes to objectivity, in media, it's not that we shouldn't aspire to be objective, but the reality is the 24-hour news cycle, the amount of information out there, in order to be competitive, in order to be relevant, and most importantly, in order to be informative, objectivity doesn't matter as much, for example, as transparency, as accountability, with the multiplicity of voices. And so when we talk about verification, the reality is, as you know, Al Jazeera has seen time and time again, and as it has presented, you can't verify everything, and you shouldn't have to verify everything. Because of the real-time nature of news, there are certain things that oftentimes in the Al Jazeera Bulletin and CNN, and even in writing at Al Monitor, and on the Huffington Post, and amongst bloggers who would fall under the category of citizen journalism, you present information as it's presented to you based on a series of judgments that you make, which, like real reporting on the ground, are derived from your own experience, and whether or not, to Barbara's point, that source is a source you've trusted in the past, and it's a symbiotic relationship.
Are you responsible to correct yourselves when
Yes,
you've made an
absolutely,
error?
and
you've
immediately.
Yeah, and that's where the transparency comes in. If you correct yourself when you make mistakes, even if you make 6 mistakes in a week, it's much better than not being transparent and doing, frankly, what Fox does and other networks, which is to present yourself as being fair and balanced and objective, when in reality, it's laughable. There was only 2 people who laughed. Maybe it's an old joke, I don't know.
If you have questions, by the way, why don't you start lining up at our microphone so that we can include you in this discussion. Speed, competition, and Linda Sarsour, who was here on a panel yesterday and spoke really, really well, was talking repeatedly about speak truth to power. I think in our business we need to speak, we are encouraged to speak truth to the bottom line. I'm afraid, and I'd like to hear what you have to say about how beholden we are as journalists in the professional world to turning a profit and to being commercially viable. And is perhaps that one of the reasons we turn to citizen journalists we don't have to pay and who maybe bring in very sensational pieces of information that will titillate our audience to tune in. What are your views on that, Barbara?
Well, I think in Al-Maner's case, it's free, first of all. Anybody can go on it, so there's no paywall. It's a startup, and we don't have to make a profit, at least initially. So, I mean, that's terrific. And, there aren't that many outlets like that, but there are some, so people should definitely, I think, gravitate toward those. I also work for a think tank, which does not have to, I mean, it has to support itself, but it doesn't have to turn a profit. So, when this huge transition began in journalism, let's face it, it's been very hard for some of us older people who were born and raised in print, and it was very disconcerting, frankly. And I sort of railed against it. But now there are so many interesting outlets. So, for example, if I write something for Al-Monitor that my editor does not want to use for whatever reason, I can put it on the Huffington Post.
Yes, you can.
Immediately. Now, I won't get paid for it, but it'll be out there. So there's this tremendous sense of liberation. In the old days, your editors were your jailers. And, if you got really fed up, you could write a book maybe, but they could prevent you from having a voice. Now, you're unhappy about something? Put it on Twitter. Write it for the HuffPost. Do what you like. And so, I think now that I'm adjusting to this model, and I rather like it.
Now, we've got a long line. I'm going to beg you, please ask questions. These are our experts. Please ask them questions. Let's see what we've got.
Thank you very much for this interesting session. My first question, can I ask two?
If they're short.
Okay. Anisa Mehdi said, how come a fire in this room is news and us gathering here is not news? When can we start building bridges and creating our own news? And that would lead me to my second question is, I've been asking, or I suggested that Al-Jazeera have a Midwest office in Chicago or in the Midwest of the United States to cover our issues and to introduce the world or educate the world about our issues in the United States, Arab American issues in the United States, bridge the gap between us and the rest of the world. We are building news in the United States, and we are leading in a lot of issues. And
are you asking, is there a forum for this to be covered?
So is that economically challengeable for Al-Jazeera to do so? If so, is it possible to train citizen journalism in the United States to cover for Al-Jazeera? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Abderrahim?
I mean, Al-Jazeera, first of all, and many people here may already know this, Al-Jazeera does have a journalism training center in Doha. And it works not just with the staff of Al-Jazeera, it works with everyone who is keenly interested in doing journalism training. In tough situations such as what we were talking about in Syria, in Yemen, in Egypt, obviously, if you're going to work with citizen journalists, you need to provide them to the extent possible. It's not always possible, but to the extent possible, you need to provide them with some sort of training, and that does happen. For the United States, I don't know how many Americans or Arab Americans have gone through the training center in Doha. We don't have any formal training here, based here in the United States per se. Yet.
Can I answer the first question she asked about the fire? She said, I think, why are you not creating your own news, or why are we not? You did create your own news. You asked a question at a conference, as a journalist might. There are people here there's about 100 publishing platforms and accounts here, I'm hoping. in terms of Twitter. You have access to social media, and that is news at the end of the day. As we've outlined, that's how news breaks. Perhaps this isn't the most compelling conversation. I apologize. I'm hoping it will be. But, you are creating news. And, when Barbara mentioned very quickly earlier about the media and some of the struggles with turning a profit, I think collaboration is invariably the new competition. It's more important in the sense that we have journalists from Al Monitor on HuffPost Live often to tell us of what's happening in Turkey. She mentioned if she can't publish because the editor doesn't let her outlet. There's a million outlets, including social media, including presumably even Al-Jazeera. They take many publications and articles for their website that others, don't take. So I hope that answers.
Let me tag just a quick thought to what Ahmed has just said. I think what has happened since Maidan Tahrir over 2 years ago is that you've had the birth of this Catholic marriage now between social media and television.
Catholic with a small c.
With a small c. With a very small c. And you cannot separate the two any longer. It's done. It's sealed. If you try to separate as a television network, for example.
And that is Catholic with a large C. No divorce.
But the other part of what I wanted to say is that once you have this marriage may not pose a challenge for Americans. It certainly poses a challenge for people in the Arab world for the simple reason that all this stuff that we're talking about now is connected to literacy. And when you're talking about an audience where illiteracy reaches as high as 60% of the population, then you obviously need television because people rely on visuals. But even within that, now that you get YouTube and you get pictures from zones of war that television does not have access to, you rely on social media. So the bond between social media, the Catholic with a small c bond between social media and television is now unbreakable.
And I have to quickly add to his point, even though literacy is a huge problem, the reason that 51% of all Saudi internet users have a Twitter account is because social media is an outlet to have conversations that you previously couldn't have even on television, even on pan-Arab satellite networks like Al-Jazeera, like Al-Arabiya. And to his point, to illustrate it, and perhaps this is a little self-referential, I know there's a lot of questions. I just want to say, when I was at Al-Jazeera's The Stream, the aim was to bring social media into the TV fold. They succeeded, and we succeeded, I guess. Rami's here, he's still working for The Stream. Anyway, the point is, at HuffPost Live, what are we doing? It's TV on the internet. So if you can't read, but you have access to the internet, you can consume what appears to be TV-like programming, even if you are illiterate, on the internet, and contribute by clicking a button if you can't write because you're illiterate, and speaking. So the barriers continue to be brought down, and I don't have any religious metaphors, but that was it.
But you mentioned Shakespeare earlier. I think if Shakespeare were alive today, instead of a horse, my kingdom for a horse, he would have said a laptop, my kingdom for a laptop. Right. That's where we are now.
Very good. Next question, please.
Well, thank you for inviting me. My name is Gas Bisharat, Vassam Bisharat. I'm from LA. I have a question for you, Barbara. You mentioned something about the crazy Iranian leader and his comment. I agree fully with you, but we don't hear much about the crazy right-wing Israeli leaders who put us on daily basis down and who put other Jewish people down, especially their women as well. We don't see that on television a lot. Try to be very powerful and drive Saturdays in Jerusalem, and those people will take care of you. This is the bottom line to it. So it's straight-cut discrimination between covering the Middle East versus Israel. And I don't see a reporter yet, I've been here for 42 years, with guts to really stand up and say the truth. Okay, and that includes Al Jazeera. And 1 second, please, because I'm coming back to Al Jazeera. My question to the gentleman from Al Jazeera is how you separate the fundamental coverage of your media from that of the influence of your government that's funding Al Jazeera.
Very
and thank
good.
you.
Very good
Thank
question.
you. Okay, so let's go Barbara first.
I I appreciate your question very much. I mentioned Ahmadinejad because I have the Iranian elections on my brain since I've been following that very closely. And as you all know, the Iranians have elected apparently the least worst candidate who was presented to them. And with great courage come out and elected someone who did not seem to be the... I'm sorry. I said the reason I have Iran on the brain is because of their elections. They've elected the least worst candidate and someone who hopefully will help resolve the dispute, the nuclear dispute between Iran and the United States. And people of Iran have shown great courage in coming out and voting, even though the whole world said this was going to be a nothing election, a sham election. At least 70% came out and they voted for Hassan Rouhani. So that's why I had that on the brain. In terms of Israel, I think there's a lot of coverage actually these days, and certainly on Al-Monitor, of the very, very deep differences between the secular and ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel. This new coalition that came in, still under Bibi Netanyahu, has a number of people in it who insisted that ultra-Orthodox had to be drafted into the military, that they had to work, that they have to actually pay their dues in society. And just one small anecdote. I've been to Jerusalem many times, and I always have tried to stay at the American Colony Hotel, which, as you all know, is very gorgeous. And the only time I've ever been hit with rocks, the only time I've ever been stoned in the Middle East, was walking from
Stoned as in stone?
as in people throwing stones, was walking from the
That's as
American...
small as.
We won't talk about the other. As walking from the American Colony Hotel toward downtown Jerusalem through an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood called Mea Sherim, where I guess my pants were too tight or something, and so it was actually ultra-Orthodox who were throwing rocks at me. Anyway, I have. I've spoken about this. I think that this issue has come to the fore, and I don't think there's any censorship about it. I really don't.
But there may be a deeper question here, which is how the Iranian president, as an example, or Saddam Hussein or Bashar al-Assad, how they are reported as dictators who are bad for their countries, who are threats to the United States, where the Israeli leaders may also have that threat and pose a threat with being... To the interests, American interests in the region, who have been rude to our leaders, our vice president on visits and so on and so forth, and that reporting does not come across, either in print or on the air.
Well, you know, Israel...
That is not reported, is the way to...
It's not democracy either. Please don't tell me now.
Well, the Israelis, citizens, do have an opportunity to get rid of these people. It's true. I mean, it's true. Whereas Saddam Hussein, you know, it finally took a hangman's noose to get rid of him. So this is the case. But I think again,
and false information.
There is plenty of content on Al-Jazeera. There's plenty of content on Al-Monitor that criticizes the government of Israel for its policies. If there isn't what you want to see in mainstream American media, it's up to you guys to demand it.
Yeah.
And make sure that your voices are heard.
I remember being asked, before we went in, the whole question about weapons of mass destruction, which I think you're talking about with regard to Iraq.
As well as Al-Qaeda being in Iraq, which it wasn't.
Which
and
was
now,
not
and now,
before,
of
and
course,
sectarian violence in Iraq. And there was a cartoon I remember seeing, and Bush is saying, weapons of mass destruction, and he's reaching into his pocket for a bunch of receipts. He says, yeah, we sold them. We gave them the weapons of mass destruction. On the other hand, they probably used them up during the war with Iran.
They did.
On the battlefields, that World War I style battlefield of the Iraq-Iran war, another tragedy. But they were gone by the time we invaded.
Right.
They were no longer an issue. And the media kept talking about weapons of mass destruction.
One other thing about Israel, if I may. I mean, Netanyahu comes and he goes to Congress and he gets 10, 20, 30 standing ovations. I mean, are you telling the American media not to report this? This is a fact.
No, I'm saying to
So-
the American media to say the truth, that Israel is not democracy, and that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
Anyway.
Now, there was a question for Al Jazeera. Do you even remember it?
Sure. The issue...
And let's try to keep ourselves a little bit briefer, because we've
Okay.
got still a good long line of questions. You may.
Yeah, I just suggest that, because there are people standing in line for questions. So if you have any questions, just stand in line and ask them. And I think it will be easier
We'll move
for the
forward,
panel to answer the
Thank you,
point.
Ram. Abderrahim.
I think the gentleman's question was about how Al-Jazeera separates itself from the government of Qatar in terms of what it covers or does not cover. Look, I worked for BBC World Service for a decade, and we were fed this line at the BBC, that the BBC was 100% independent and objective. And then one day I opened the charter of the BBC, and the charter of the BBC said at that time that the government of the United Kingdom had the right to ask the BBC to broadcast in a particular language to a particular part of the world. Couldn't tell them what to broadcast, but it had the right to tell them where to broadcast and in what language. And that obviously collocated with the political interest of the government of the United Kingdom. And I think that one of the mistakes that we at Al-Jazeera make, since we're talking about Al-Jazeera, but one of the mistakes that we as journalists keep talking about, we keep talking about independence. If you take the government of the case of Al-Jazeera, the Qataris set up the channel, they pump hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars annually into it. You're not gonna convince me that they do it because they want it to be a charity. They obviously want to reap some kind of dividend from that money. And that investment has paid off a hundredfold since the inception of Al-Jazeera. If you think about the prestige and the political influence that Qatar now wields, not just in the Middle East, but everywhere in the world. So I think we need to put this in perspective. We should all stop going around saying whatever medium we work for is 100% independent.
Of course it's not.
It's not true.
If I can just very quickly add one thing, because
But let me just say that. Having said that, knowing the history of broadcasting in the Middle East, I do feel comfortable saying that Al-Jazeera is probably one of the most independent outlets that we've had in the Arab world.
Absolutely. Do you want something to, was that what you were going to say?
I was just going to say that the question and the answer, I think both illustrate an earlier point, which is there is sadly no objectivity, whether it's from a government's stated objectives or a corporation. And that's why objectivity is not as important as Al-Jazeera and every other media organization being transparent and accountable, because it is right for people, and I say this as someone who admires Al-Jazeera and who also recognizes the incredible role it's played in amplifying and bringing about progress and change in the region, but also in the world. It's important that when questions are raised about, the disparity between Al-Jazeera, for example, as being funded by Qatar, existing as a media organization covering, for example, the war in Syria, and Qatar as a government being involved as a major player in the war in Syria, allegations coming from the US that they're funding Jabhat al-Nusra, which is one of the rebel factions that, of course, is deemed to be a terrorist organization. The reason I say this isn't to be controversial. The reason I say this is because we all care about, I'm assuming as Arabs, as Arab Americans, what's happening in Syria. And so it's important that we try to understand, because it is so immensely complex, that with more transparency and objectivity, not just from Al-Jazeera's part, but from all players, including media players, I think we'll achieve a better understanding of what's happening.
And we need some
might I
time
be
to
heard,
process
please?
it all. Please.
All right. My question follows up to the distinguished gentleman from Al Jazeera, and it builds on the comments you folks have just been making. Al Jazeera in the past was known for reporting news that the governments didn't like. Now it seems to be reporting only news that governments hand out. As examples, Barky Baboon's attack on Libya, his attack on Syria. Now, are the reasons for this moving en masse from the BBC World Service to Al Jazeera, or is it simply the Qatari government's repressive policies because it's deeply involved in the wars against Libya and Syria? Could you clarify that, please?
Well, I'll answer the part of that deals with journalism, the part of it that deals with politics. I'm not a politician. Look, since Egypt, I think what we have seen in terms of the audience of Al-Jazeera, in terms of access, in terms of angle, and in terms of so many other issues related to Al-Jazeera, there's been a very interesting topsy-turviness about Al-Jazeera. People who used to like it, many of them no longer like it. And people who used to viscerally dislike it, many of them now really like it. And it's part of the challenge that Al Jazeera is facing in the new landscape that's emerged in the Middle East since its role in covering Tahrir Square. There's an enormous amount more of competition that didn't exist before. If you take, for example, just as one example, if you take the elections in Tunisia almost 2 years ago, it was obvious that Tunisians suddenly discovered their own national media, which was perfectly natural, perfectly normal. So they followed the election in their own country on Tunisian television, not on Al Jazeera. But there's a pattern here. This story, what happened in Tunisia in this particular example, we had seen it over many years in a place like Egypt, for example. Egyptians had developed a taste for their own national broadcasters, but in times of war, whether it's Gaza or Lebanon or elsewhere, that audience tends to flock back to Al Jazeera because Al Jazeera has the resources which it can deploy very quickly. The issue of access has become a problem, with most of the Arab world having become insecure since 2 years ago. So where you go, for example, in Syria, there are some parts of Syria we could reach. There are other parts of Syria we couldn't reach, and that has implications not just for what you report. It has implications for how people view what you report and how they judge your objectivity. The politics, you address that to the government of Qatar.
My name is Fatma Wasil, a Yemeni journalist. Actually, I'm going to ask a question, maybe it goes into two parts that goes in the same area. My question is, why do you think that the Arab journalism at all, is underrepresented in the United States? Do you think it's anti-Arab discrimination? Is it anti-Islam discrimination? Or it is the lack of the people who already were born here and lived here lack the good Arabic language skills?
Can we just hold it at that? I think that's plenty of a question. So is there an anti-Islamic bias in our mainstream news media, I think is what I'm hearing. And is it because of a lack of participation in part of American Muslims and American Arabs in the media?
Can I start very briefly, just with one sentence?
Thank you.
I think the sad reality is that there's somewhat of an anti-Muslim sentiment in American society and American politics, and that predates the media. I think the media is part of the messenger, and so I would argue that that's the reason, and that's where we should begin.
Begin with more information about Islam?
I'm just saying, when we blame the media for Islamophobia or an anti-Islam bias, I think we have to look at the government and where that's coming from in 9/11. And it might seem overly simplistic, but the media doesn't just create things for the sake of creating it. Obviously, there's collusion, perhaps, as some would allege, between corporations and the government. But I think the way the American government reacted to 9/11 in particular, whether rightfully or wrongfully, helped dictate the media's coverage. These terms, axis of evil, and you made a joke about it earlier, but if you look at the way that the government has instructed the media and the American people to perceive the Islamic or Arab world, it is one of an imminent threat. And I think we are still augmenting that reality.
I'd like to get Barbara's view on that because,
it's a good question. I mean, I don't know that whether it's that fewer Arab Americans choose to go into media. I mean, it's a very difficult and challenging profession these days. It's not one that pays a great deal of money. And if you're a first generation in this country, you know, you probably would do better being a doctor or a lawyer, an engineer, a web developer, certainly, than being a journalist. So I don't know that there's any particular conscious bias. You do see different waves of people who go into professions. Right now I see a lot of Indian Americans, for example, who seem to be getting into media, into television media, so, and also print. But I don't think there's any established policy of discrimination against Arab Americans who want to become journalists.
Well, I will say that when I got into broadcasting in 1982, I was the only Arab American in the newsrooms that I worked in, Eyewitness News, CBS Evening News, Nightline, whatever it was. And the silver lining of September 11th has been our young Arab Americans and young Muslim Americans are seeing possibilities for themselves in the public sphere. So not just medicine, engineering, and so on, but law, public relations, and journalism are becoming, and that way we're part of the conversation, and we can offer other interview possibilities and different databases to the news establishment. And it happens shway, you know, it is happening, but it's in process, and that's what I've observed.
Just give me 15 seconds, if you don't mind, literally 15 seconds. I think since we're talking about objectivity, we have to be objective. I think we have to be careful to distinguish between bias and Islamophobia. Islamophobia, nobody's arguing that, especially since 9/11, Islamophobia in this country and in Europe has widened in scope. Sure. In terms of bias, there is bias here about us Arabs and Muslims in the same way that in Arab societies there is bias against Americans and Europeans and Christians and what have you. And that is normal because we've had a long history, centuries of confrontation and conflict. And that feeds our prism as journalists, whether we like it or not.
Sure.
But I think it's very important to make the distinction between bias and Islamophobia.
Thank you. Next question, next person, please.
No,
I'm sorry, we've got to move on to the next person. Thank you for a very elucidating question.
I'd like to say that I understand you have Al-Jazeera English. When you come to America, you should put it on free television, not cable, because all the cable companies will not broadcast in English Al-Jazeera.
Okay, can we just address, I'm going to be really quick going
real
through
quick.
it. No Oprah Winfrey here anymore. What do you have to say about that? Abderrahim, or even in the back, Rami, is it Rami, Sami, Rami? How do you go on to not cable?
Internet.
Al-Jazeera English is available free to air right now. You go to the internet and on some cable stations.
Over the internet, I know, but not on TV, like RT.
It is, sir, actually available free to air in some major cities.
Why don't you speak with, this is also
And another thing about it, this is what I want to say. Nobody knows that you can get Al Jazeera on your cell phone.
Thank you.
Free,
Thank you
in English. You
Okay.
get second and third generations of Arabs, they don't speak Arabic, and they don't understand Arabic.
So we can get it on our cell phone.
You can get everything on your cell phone.
Okay, thank
That's
you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. You need to be brief, because I've seen you with the microphone earlier in this. I want a question in 10 seconds.
My name is Shafiqa. أنا من اليمن, Arab Americans. And أشكر الجزيرة على اللايت اللي نجده منها. ولكن لماذا اليمن لم تغطى doesn't deserve the complete coverage of its revolution during the revolution were covered in Egypt, as in Yemen they were all together going together and covered night and day, but not Yemen. And who stopped that covering? Please let me know.
Why are we not, thank you,
And
why
you are listening to kingdoms around Yemen, not to Yemeni people? Thank you.
Yemen? Rogue state person?
What can I say? Egypt is the most populous Arab country, and it's a bigger story. It's a bigger story.
I watch a lot of coverage on Al-Jazeera about Yemen. I've done a lot of coverage on Al-Jazeera about Yemen, so I don't know what the answer is.
I mean, there's also the simple fact that in Egypt, the game was over in 18 days. In Yemen, it went on for months and months, and then it went into this mechanism created for Ali Abdullah Saleh to step out, which completely muddled the story. It made it very difficult for us to cover it. I mean, you cannot stay on a story like that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the way we did on Egypt. It's just not feasible.
Also, major media have bureaus in Cairo, and most do not in Yemen. So, just in terms of.
And a drone strike took out one of the most
Well, look, I mean, we can make a whole litany of criticisms of why Al Jazeera covered this way. Yes, there were problems with the coverage, and some of them had to do with the decisions made by the editorial team in Al Jazeera in Doha. Some of them had to do with the logistics of covering these stories. It wasn't always possible to get into Syria or Yemen or Bahrain. There may have been other stuff that people are talking about in terms of interference. I don't have anything. I cannot put my hand on my heart and tell you there was or there wasn't interference. But I know it wasn't always easy to cover those stories the way it was relatively easy to cover Tunisia or Egypt.
And it will be that way going into the future. I mean, we are human beings doing the best we can.
And just one thing, since this is a panel about citizen journalism, I have very many friends and citizen journalist friends who are from Yemen, women and men from all different political spectrums who are very vocal and publish information, videos, photos on many different websites. And that is an outlet, and I think it's unfair. And I think the greatest thing about Al Jazeera, just sitting here, quite frankly, looking back, is this discussion. I mean, you could blame Al Jazeera for everything in the world or nothing, but it's about time that we actually have these provocative discussions. And if anything, to Al Jazeera's credit.
I'm sorry, you're not standing on the line. Forgive me.
That's your opinion, and that's what's incredible. Al Jazeera's allowed people to have civic engagement and helped amplify a lot of different people's opinions.
So we are in a time constraint right now. I'm going to ask each of you to give, you can't ask your question anymore. You have to say what area you want discussed and sit down, and then we will take, I want to hear about fill in the blank and sit down. I'm going to take notes, and each of us will do our best to address it quickly in the next 5.5 minutes. 10.5 minutes.
موسى شحالي فلسطيني. My question is, who take punishment to the media, or who could make punishment to the media when the media make false report about the Middle Eastern people who live in the United States as innocent people, and they accusing them for the crime?
Okay, so who punishes the media for making false reports about American?
Who could punish?
Okay.
I'd like to know.
Okay, we'll take that into consideration. Thank you. Delinda?
So my question is, will citizen journalism kind of destroy paid reporters? How about who gets paid? You're saying, oh, we don't have to pay reporters. Well, so do you have to be a real estate agent instead of a reporter and just do it on the side?
It's a good question. Thank you.
Moderator. How can we utilize citizen journalism, as the ADC, the media department, to break and crack that mainstream media that is absolutely very difficult for us to get into?
How do we use citizen journalism to crack into mainstream?
It's about bias in the media, addressed to Barbara in regards to Iran. You mentioned that recently the new president is moderate and he will resolve the issue of nuclear weapons.
I hope.
For the past 30 and 40 years, we know that of a state in the Middle East that owns nuclear weapons. And have you been able to address the issue in the open media? because it's ironic that we know somebody has it and we don't do anything about it, but somebody who we think might have it and nothing is, and we are attacking them, and we want to, and the irony that the country that has it is the only country that is raising hell about Iran.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi. I was just struck by the comment that a reporter can make 6 mistakes in a row, 6 days in a row, and then come back and on the basis of transparency recover from that and say, oh, my bad, I made 6 mistakes. But I'd like you to elaborate. That may have been an exaggeration, but it does happen.
It wasn't an exaggeration. It was a hypothetical argument to juxtapose what's more important, transparency or stated objectivity. We all make mistakes.
In that case, let's talk about that. If you can elaborate on that, because there are serious consequences with not reporting the truth. And if you can elaborate on how you can report false things and let them go on for so long and not see those
I said immediately.
Okay, we're going to get you to do that.
Okay.
We'll get you to do that. And last but not least.
Hello, Barbara. I think I heard you mention that if we don't like what we see in the media or how it's where the focus is or what the bias is, that we can do something to change it. And I was wondering what we can do to change it besides calling them out on Twitter or writing them letters. Thank you.
So we have a couple of questions on accountability. The question about punishing, how do we get punished, quote unquote, for false reports, and I think Ahmed can address that. The bias in media from Barbara, please. Abderrahim, if you would talk about how can citizen journalists and ADC crack into the mainstream, because I think Al-Jazeera is now qualified as mainstream, inshallah. And then I want us to close with answering Delinda's question, will citizen journalism destroy opportunities for paid reporters? So let's start with Barbara and then Abderrahim and then Ahmed.
So you want us to touch on all these various things.
I want you to especially touch on the bias in media with regard to nuclear weapons and so on.
I always write about Israel having nuclear weapons, and I always write that one reason Israel doesn't want Iran to get nuclear weapons is because it doesn't want to lose its monopoly on nuclear weapons in the Middle East. There is a taboo in Israel about writing about it. There's no taboo writing about it in this country. Well, then you're reading the wrong people, and you're reading the wrong news organizations if you think it's not being mentioned or it doesn't get the attention that it should. I agree there's bias in the media. I mean, quite frankly, I used to write for USA Today, and whenever I would criticize Israel, I would get emails from various groups complaining about me, complaining to my editors. If I ever wrote anything that was unfair to Arabs, I swear I never got any similar complaints. There is an organized, I mean, do I have to spell it out for you guys? You know that there is an organization. It's the people who don't want you to criticize Israel are very, very well organized. You guys need to be better organized. You know that.
It starts with us, right?
So I'm in the business of journalism. I'm not in the business of grassroots organization. But organizations like this are clearly very important. When you read something that grossly distorts news about an Arab country or about Arab Americans, you have to get right on it, and you have to go to that reporter and say, this is garbage, why did you write it? Our responsibility is just to try to be as fair as we can and to write as best we can. It's difficult, but there are things I'll monitor. It's a startup. It was started by an Arab American who's from Houston who wanted to have more information about the Middle East available in English to anybody who wanted to read it. And I hope there are more efforts like this. But you really have to speak out when you see bias. Absolutely. It's your responsibility.
Thank you. Abderrahim, what about getting into the mainstream, getting some of the stories from ADC and from this Arab American agenda maker group?
Yeah, I think the cracking into mainstream media is, if it's not inevitable, it's already happening, as we said earlier. I think it's becoming increasingly difficult for television news outlets not to weave social media into their coverage. But I think one favor that social media could do themselves in terms of cracking a bigger hole, so to speak, into mainstream media is the issue of trustworthiness and credibility that we've been talking about. I was once talking to, since the lady was talking about Yemen, I was talking to a Yemeni journalist on Al-Jazeera. This is during the protests in Sana'a. And he said that Ali Abdullah Saleh had embezzled something like $24 billion and took it out of the country. And I said, what's your source for that? And he said, I saw it in social media. I mean, really, Ali Abdullah Saleh could not have smuggled $24,000 if he'd been busy smuggling since the Queen of Sheba. There isn't just that enough wealth in Yemen for him to be able to smuggle 24,000. So 24 billion dollars. So the issue is, even as your social media, there isn't anybody to punish you, as the gentleman suggested. There's no punishment here. Only the audience can punish you. But obviously, in terms of rewards, reaping the rewards, you have to build your own credibility. And by building your own credibility, your sourcing has got to be right.
Thank you. Thank you. Good. Okay, and what about this, the results of the mistakes? You know, the errors and
yeah,
what
I think maybe she misunderstood what I was trying to say, or maybe I misunderstood your question, because I was referring to someone who makes 6 mistakes in a week as being an extreme example. But let's
not personalize it. What about the results from the mistakes that we make?
I'm not personalizing it by any means. I'm just trying to say, you know, for example, if you make a mistake 6 times, 26 times, it's a hypothetical, 2,600 times, 22 million or billion times, if it was Abdullah Saleh, as long as you are transparent and accountable about however many mistakes you make and make them, to Barbara's earlier point, correct them as quickly as possible and as publicly as possible, then people will forgive you. Whether you are a citizen journalist, and this is my opinion, or if you are a professional journalist or work for Al-Jazeera or for whatever, Al-Monitor, Huffington Post, what have you. That's why I firmly believe that this notion of objectivity, which is what some people lean on rather than correct their mistakes, undermines the truth, however subjective it might be, more than someone who does make 6 mistakes a week, or a news organization that does get 6 facts wrong. And also on the notion of how to break into mainstream media, as a citizen journalist, be smart. Be connected, leverage the platforms that you use, find commonality, organize, mobilize. You know, to Barbara's point, why do we not know about Israel's nuclear weapons? Why is Israel allowed to act with impunity? It's because there's no organization in the media or on the grassroots level politically in America that can rival those who are organizing to keep Israel out of those kinds of conversations. And a quick example is CNN's coverage of Khader Adnan and the Palestinian prisoners and hunger strikers. I mean, these are stories that for decades, and I would argue it is changing quite dramatically, at least, you know, in my 10 years of even just, you know, being in the field. Like, you would never have thought that story would have existed on CNN. I can guarantee you the only reason it did is because people were organizing online. Al-Jazeera covered it as they would, because Al-Jazeera is not objective, and they approach that story. And the reason I say they're not objective is because no one else is. So all I'm trying to say is, at the end of the day, if you want to influence people, organize and leverage the platforms and tools, regardless of whether you're professional or you're an amateur or whatever you want to call yourself. We all have a voice. Technology is moving much quicker than the business and the laws around the business. So you're going to be punished by the audience or by your editors, and it doesn't matter because you're going to be discredited either way.
A few years ago, a famous news outlet, which shall remain unnamed, was dubbed as being fast with the news, faster with the correction. And ultimately, those mistakes, in addition to having consequences, they do catch up with your credibility.
Eventually, right? Right. And will citizen journalists put us out of business, take over our jobs? What's the future? What do your crystal balls say about that?
I don't think so, because one thing I've noticed in my long career is that there are still relatively few people who can actually absorb information, analyze it, and present it in an entertaining manner. No offense to all you citizen journalists out there, but you still need people who know how to write. So hopefully there will be there will be a means of paying for this kind of content long into the future.
No, she's right. My grandmother, for example, when you talk to her about social media, she goes, la, 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 la. She can't read or write. She wants the visual. She wants television. So, you know, television is going to be secure for a long time until everybody around the world can read and write. Remember the famous song, the video killed radio star? Everybody had anticipated the death of radio. It didn't happen. Everybody now is anticipating the death of television. Didn't happen. Everybody at some point will be anticipating the death of citizen journalism. It ain't gonna happen.
I just quickly want to say, no way in hell that will happen. And the reason is because our job will always be to provide context, regardless of who's providing the information. Whether
Context and analysis.
And analysis and writing. And, you know, citizen journalists don't have to write. They can report. They can take a photo and they can be a reliable source and they can provide information. For example, just very quickly, Al-Jazeera, during the early days of the Egypt revolution, had Egyptian journalists on the ground, and they were acting in the capacity, Ayman Muhyiddin, Shireen Tadros, others, they were acting in the capacity of professional journalists on air. And then when the internet was shut, because a story can have many different angles thrown at it, when the internet was shut, all of a sudden, they are citizen journalists. They might have been still getting their Al-Jazeera salary, I would hope, and I can only imagine, but they were tweeting, they were sending emails to their friends because they didn't have access. Well, aren't they citizens of the country upon which they're reporting? Aren't they disseminating information? Sure, they might have credibility because they have the name Al-Jazeera and protection, and PJ Crowley, the assistant secretary, was going to tweet when Mubarak detained 6 Al-Jazeera journalists that you must release them. So they have that leverage, but they're citizen journalists. It's a symbiotic relationship. We shouldn't see citizen journalists as a threat. I'm a professional journalist. Some people call me that. I don't necessarily identify myself as that. I'm a storyteller. I'm a citizen journalist. I mean, you could get paid for things. If you have compelling information and you throw it up on any blog and it serves a value, you're going to get money for that eventually. And then do you become professional because you're getting money for it? A lot of journalists who I worked with at Al-Jazeera weren't trained. They never went to training. They trained themselves, especially on the Arabic channel, as according to certain friends of mine. So I don't know. What is a professional
But I mean, if you think about the millions of people who were mobilized against the FARC in Colombia, for example, it wasn't television that did it. It was social media. If you think now about the millions of Turks who are being mobilized, it's not television that's doing it. It's social media. But for context and depth, you do need television.
So I'm going to conclude with what has been going on in all of our sessions here at the ADC convention, which is with an ask. What we're doing is asking you to play part of the game, to tweet about the fact that there was no fire here, but fires grew in our bellies with excitement and enthusiasm and possibility for reporting. So tweet #ADC 2013 and write something about this session. And the handle is @ADC Tweets. Okay, so you now all have an assignment to do for participating, and I want to thank everybody for being here, especially Barbara, Abderrahim, and Ahmed. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much, Anisa, for moderating the session. I just want everyone to know that our next session will take place here. It will start in 10 minutes. And I want to plug Dr. Shaheen's book. He actually started tracing stereotypes in the media against Arabs way before we started. You can buy his book from the atrium as well.